This session is titled Therolinguistics, Fabulous Fiction, and we have two brilliant speakers. I'm delighted that Susan McHugh kindly agreed to chair the panel. She is a professor of English at the University of New England. She is author, most recently, of Love in a Time of Slaughters, Human-Animal Stories Against Genocide and Extinction, 2019, and co-editor of the Animal Satire. Last year, she took the lead in designing a canine fable panel for us called Restorative Fables for Wild Canid, chaired by Jeanne Dubino, today's speaker. So it is fantastic to invite her to chair this panel. And I believe she is also a big fan of the subject of therolinguistics, which another speaker, McHugh, is going to discuss shortly. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Kaori, and thank you so much for organizing not just this session, but this lovely series of panels over the last yesterday and today, and the series throughout the past year and more moving forward. This is just so exciting, and we all are appreciating your work so much in bringing us all together here. I will introduce each speaker right before they speak, and I therefore will start with Matt Churlew, who is a writer, researcher, and translator from Perth, Australia. His fiction has appeared in Westerly, Cosmos, and Plutonics, and his essays in Island, New Literary History, and Biosemiotics. He edits the book series Animalities at Edinburgh University Press, which, if you haven't checked it out, is really got an amazing set of titles. Most recently, he collaborated on a story with performance artist Stellark's prosthetic head to appear in the Flame Tree volume, Learning to be Human. And I turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Susan. I'm going to read a short story in the tradition of Ursula Le Guin's Therolinguistics and Stanislaw Lem's reviews of non-existent books. What grew from the Acacia seeds, A Century of Therolinguistics. Actually, I even have a PowerPoint which, if I press this green square share screen button, does that work? Someone tell me if that's okay. Yes? All right. It was an excellent idea to collect, after 100 years, the key texts of the discipline into a single omnibus volume. It can only be hoped that this anthology will be the catalyst to spur more attention to this field and at last bring therolinguistics into much deserved and sorely needed earthwide recognition. While for many, the borders between this speculative pursuit and the positivist sciences of chemicals and correlations remain fuzzy and unclear, now at least any curious student or researcher who has pondered the status of animals' narratives can benefit from consulting the vast and intriguing set of contributions here arranged. Therolinguistics is rather unique as a discipline in that its genesis is entirely fictional. Of course, over the years, a not insignificant number of science fiction's most eccentric trailblazers have been known to pass the time founding cults and establishing religions. Still, no others can lay claim to an actual science. And while intellectual historians might joke or indeed seriously argue that every field is shadowed by its own mythical origins, from Darwin's Just So stories to Freud's neurotic patients to Kernau's celestial patterns, neither biology, nor psychology, nor the new cosmogony, nor any other science, no matter how hard or soft, can spin a yarn quite like this. I don't imagine that even Ursula K. Le Guin herself, for all her speculative wizardry, could really have imagined that her 1974 thought experiment would in fact, after 50 years of sporadic cultural gestation, give birth to a very real and empirical discipline, let alone that it would go on to boast such a long and storied history of knowledge production. Yet that is, of course, precisely what happened when, in the heady days of the post-pandemic, post-fossil fuel, post-upheaval Renaissance, within the new autochthonous and autonomous pluriversities that emerged in reclaimed mining cities and rebuilt war ruins, a diverse group of itinerant eco-humanists turned their attentions to the tales of the beasts. This anthology's editor, the widely respected Professor Nicolai, having spent many years immersed in the archives, has himself already quite thoroughly relayed the history of this emergent avant-garde and their foundational work, of the society's own initially performative and ironic character before the growing recognition and post-hoc justification of their surprising yet indubitably replicable results turned the whole enterprise on its head, and of the discipline's subsequent institutionalization, the establishment of its norms and standards, the formation of subdisciplines and outgroups, and all the rest of the dialectical developments to be expected of such scholarly organizations. The present book at once doubles down on the canon formation described in Nicolai's 2-volume monograph and goes some way towards broadening and complicating this picture, insofar as it includes a number of controversial works and does not always take the expected turns in its editorial decisions. The disciplinary isolation of therolinguistics, despite all of its resourcefulness and creativity, has been somewhat disheartening to observe. It might perhaps have been expected to find a home or voice within the so-called animal turn in humanities and social sciences scholarship of the late 20th century, an academic swerve that, like others of the time, sought to complicate the 60s foregoing linguistic turn with attention to material embodiment, in particular that of other species than human. But as more than one critic has noted with regret, the pathways were not often found or the opportunities taken for a genuine rapprochement between eco-critical and zoocritical analyses of human texts and therolinguistic investigations into animal literary production. Of course, with their dancing bees and inventing birds and singing apes and other data, ethologists had regularly described learned behaviours and expressions they considered cultural, aesthetic, and even linguistic among non-human animals. But most often, the traditional boundaries of the human thereby brought into question were merely relocated, refortified, and refined. In any case, however one might ultimately seek to differentiate communication from language, the telling of stories remained, at least for the majority of scientists, not only a trait unique to Homo sapiens, but one in fact better off curbed by the advance of reason, or circumscribed within a suspiciously neoliberal model of evolutionary memetics. One notable exception to this enduring two cultures divide was the itself somewhat isolated Tartu school of bio, eco, and zoosemiotics, which resourcefully endeavoured to bridge the gap between its own, rather scientifically inclined studies of animal meaning, founded on the work of the infamous Estonian theoretical biologist Jakob von Uxküll, and the philosophical, cultural, and literary scholarship devoted to questions of human-animal entanglement that came to the fore in the still culturally dominant Anglosphere of the late 20th and early 21st century. Yet despite all of this, therolinguistics remained for the most part an insular and idiosyncratic discipline, not only developing its own habits and jargon orthogonal to wider trends, but prone as well at times to its own outbreaks of infighting and narrow-mindedness. Yet for all such lamentable, albeit somewhat inevitable characteristics, therolinguistics' minoritarian status must also be seen as having set the stage for radical innovation. Just as with the fortuitous adaptations and inventive transformations of evolutionary isolation and niche construction, one might come to see the geopolitical and institutional sequestration of the discipline as a powerful source of its productivity and novelty. This at least is the case made by this volume, as it leaves behind the more disreputable and dubious episodes of both boundary policing and conceptual free play to collect the best examples from the Flagstone Journal's extensive history, both fictional and factual. Professors in the new pluriversities wishing their students to learn how not to interpret animal signals from such unedifying episodes as the muskox gland trials, the Great Goose debate, or the Brooklyn Pheromonstration debacle will have to find some way around the withered and defensive academic publishing conglomerate's last remaining paywall. Thankfully, this open access volume has, under the judicious eye of its editor, been packed cover to cover with exemplars and highlights. The volume is divided into 5 main sections. Part 1 collects the discipline's classic papers, from Le Guin's landmark entomological revolution expressed in the acacia seeds, to the groundbreaking interpretation of bark beetle tunnel patterns, from the whale song opera weaved into aft sails by medieval boatmen, to the carnal suggestions of the symbiote octopus Ulysses relayed by Vincent Desprez. Therolinguistics' very best research in terms of methodology and empirical evidence, conceptual sophistication and theoretical contribution is well represented here. Not all of it is entirely sober. There are classic papers on hedgehog quips, orangutan one-liners, and legless lizard clowning that would put a standard comedy festival to shame. Yet all of it is serious scholarship. And there is just as much political content as purely scientific or aesthetic. As has been demonstrated since the post-human and ontological terms, what is at play in a biosocial community's creative output, its stories and songs, is not only its self-conception and the way it imagines and forms its relationship to the rest of the cosmos and its inhabitants, but also its very capacity to safeguard and reproduce itself, to refuse the designs of the powerful, most often though not always human, and to hold open space for further twists and overflows. Thus, we also read here the infamous case of dolphin rebellion reconstructed from the acid trip recordings of the Lilly experiments, as well as the first still highly contested case of a non-human serial killer noted down in the pithy pecks and hard-boiled eggs of wisdom of a literal storage pigeon. Part 2 focuses on the important topic of the human-animal relationship, delving into the enormous range of new languages and genres, plots and tropes, patois and pigeons, to have emerged within the variety of hybrid communities that humans have from the beginning sought to establish with their fellow earthlings. The editor includes here not only the classic cases of captive and immured individuals, whether the orangutan bard of Oslo Zoo or the impromptu hieroglyphic dances of South African flamingos for tourists and researchers alike, but also a range of other intriguing case studies from various stages of taming, domestication, commensalism, symbiosis, and companionship, to all manner of experiments in coexistence. These include the feral ballads of the Great Sandy Desert's Camel Brumby enclave, the elaborate mourning rituals of the reintroduced Oostvaardeplass and Grazer Collective, who concocted an entire religious system around the aloof provisioning and culling decisions of their godlike ecological managers, and a number of cases drawn from retired or escaped trainees, from the solving of the mystery of the missing mink, to the reinterpretation of Jumbo's meandering walks, to Lana's late career turn as an interpreter between conservation biologists and wild-living chimpanzees, to the Parrot Project's postmodern play, not to mention all the anecdotes of circus animals as intervening angels solving interpersonal conflicts and dilemmas, and the legacies they came to leave in the sanctuaries and communities of support where they rehabilitated or retired. Part 3 pulls together a broad range of methodological and theoretical papers that contribute to the literature by critiquing its concepts and methods or proposing new ideas and practices to be tried. Here, the discipline asks itself not only how best to record and transcribe languages other than human, but also how to most effectively expand its reach, whether through new modalities of fieldwork, through redesigned or newly contrived equipment and prosthetics, or simply through exploring more adventurous ways of both obtaining and interpreting texts. Attention to deeper timescales has opened up ancient archives of the long extinct, as in Hax's poetic translations of quaternary proboscidean migration epics, as well as the messages from far evolutionary futures unearthed in junk DNA databases. Moreover, it is opened up to view the contours of the more recent yet still prehistoric past, that period of time not so much deep as a melange of shallow episodes of hominization and civilization, in which barely repressed encounters with uncanny hominid others set the stage for the very notions of humanity and animality, not to mention monstrosity. Other highlights in this section include the psychoanalytic meditations on the mirror stages of various mimics and camouflages, the rehabilitation of the wisdom of fables against both the tradition's reduction to moralism and its scientific denigration as mere fancy, as seen, for example, in the Corvidian reconstruction of multiple versions of the Aesopian water pitcher pebble experiments, as well as, most significantly, the work by Indigenous scholars reconstituting the deeply storied scientific knowledge undergirding primordial and ongoing totemisms and animisms. The focus of part 4 is on the limits of therolinguistics, the boundaries it ought to respect or otherwise to push as it circumscribes its proper objects of study and the guiding questions that might help reveal their nature. Is the study of non-human stories limited to other members of the so-called animal kingdom, or should it be extended to plants, fungi, bacteria, to all non-living things and all dimensions of reality? Do the geological ages of the Earth themselves constitute a chronicle? Is there harmony in hydro and phototropism and melody in ocean pulses and oscillations? Such boundary-pushing questions have been posed from the outset, not only by Le Guin in the third of her original extracts, but also by her Australian counterpart, the ecofeminist historian of science and speculative fiction writer Rosalind Love, in her classic 1998 essay exploring the songs of corals, where she mused, "What are the words that invertebrates might speak?" As the editor notes, such questions grew in significance in the teens and 20s with the vegetal and mycelial turns and the new academic excitement about matter and objects, and indeed occupied their own special section in the journal for almost 3 decades from the 30s. Of course, this aspect of the discipline has at times been caught up in unhelpful demarcations and schisms, as well as fallen victim to unempirical ontological flattening. Yet at its best, as in the majority of the contributions reproduced here, it has been improperly identifying and interpreting the different capacities for meaning, language, and story, and their various forms and modalities in all manner of beings, from elephants to starfish to ticks to orchids to viruses to magnetic fields to black holes, that therolinguistics has been able not only to better understand itself and its proper domains, but also to contribute to the edification and indeed creation of other disciplines, from biosemiotics to phytolinguistics to cosmodramatics, as indeed to the newly rejuvenated project of a universal archaic grammatology. The selections in part 5, finally, are of the more speculative and experimental kind. Therolinguistics, like most other disciplines, has not been immune to the wacky and wild, from promising yet risky and ultimately failed investigations to flat-out con jobs and charlatanism. Yet the benefit of the editor's curation here is in gathering a most fascinating and indeed informative group of contentious studies, instructive as much in their productive failures as their startling successes. From the contested familial embedding of the American ape language experiments of the 1970s to the lifelong trans-animal enactment that realized Kafka's report to an academy in body and soul, and thereby contributed new impetus and ammunition to the more radical constructivist wing. From the laboratory circus that precisely measured subtle forms of non-verbal communication between performing animals and their trainers, to the misinterpretive turn that wrongly, albeit fruitfully, valorized confusion and generative misreading. From the lying animals pretending to pretend to the individuals and swarms who act as translators and diplomats between third and fourth parties. Most famously, of course, and deploying the weaponized Turing-Schaeffer test to exclude the now thankfully declining plethora of artificially intelligent counterfeits. The section concludes with the first double-blind refereed contribution to the journal inscribed directly by a non-human paw. Brought together in this fashion and read alongside Nikolai's detailed histories, the Therolinguistic Archive is justly revealed as an exceedingly vibrant and compelling scholarly assemblage. This volume does not descend too deeply into the more famous debates between the descriptivists and the transformationists, or the shortly return of the mechanists, or the strange turf war in which primatial and mammalian coteries pitted the neocortex against the limbic system, before briefly activating their basal ganglia and uniting to attack the reptilians, only to about-face and triangulate in turn on the humanists whose resurgence their bickering had perversely enabled. Nor, thankfully, does it dwell on that disillusioning decade in which, as if acting out some theatrical farce, the nascent discipline recapitulated all the blunders and disputes of its all-too-human linguist forebears, staging its own relativisms and determinisms, nativisms and functionalisms, before returning to its senses with a newly focused pragmatism, which enabled the questions appropriate to each domain of expression and interaction to emerge. Rather, the selection of texts provides one with a collage of encounters, experiments, and discoveries in which the plurality of animal stories is disclosed and recited. One cannot ultimately say if Le Guin ever imagined that her fictional acacia seeds might end up growing into such a lively and momentous ecology of therolinguistic knowledge. Yet whatever her intent or fancy, and as unlikely and remarkable as it might seem, this volume clearly demonstrates that the discipline can lay claim to a veritable intellectual forest, which is, of course, as one of her other most famous texts tells us, the very word for world. As the sympoet of cyborgs and companion species Donna Haraway wrote in a text that itself sowed early seeds for the field's transfiguration by riffing on Le Guin's original story by Eco, Evo, Devo biology, we need to reseed our souls and our homeworlds in order to flourish. An injunction that, as it turns out, has in turn become something of a mantra for my own scholarship and activism. Having been forced to find ways to survive and thrive amidst the world historical and evolutionarily unprecedented events that wrought the transition from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene, therolinguistics now finds itself in a prime position to help influence and shape the very form of the new axial age now upon us, we earthly and otherworldly inhabitants of the forest that threads the dust to the stars. Having deciphered and articulated so many non-human worlds, and giving birth to tools and techniques, prayers and practices well suited to negotiating how they might articulate well together so that all can blossom, the next step for the field to take, it seemed, will be to find non-human authors themselves capable of reviewing the discipline's history from fresh perspectives. That at least was the ironic flourish with which I had intended to conclude this review. Having myself only recently arrived on this beautiful scarred planet in the last jest, and having spent 3 phases immersed in the intriguing Terran archive of extraterrestrial conjectures, wherein I was stunned to find formulated the veridical hypothesis that we await a certain planetary maturity before disclosing our existence, I had composed this review with the intention also to demonstrate to my congenitors that humanity and its companions had rediscovered their animal wisdom and indeed arrived at the precipice of the turning. Yet it seems I had spoken too soon, for when I returned to this beautifully bound volume after a fortnight left on my garden table in order to check over my assessment, you can only imagine my surprise and delight upon opening it to the original Le Guin text to find that a worm or creature of some kind had already begun to perform their own poetic response, eating away at certain words and leaving me with a marvelous sample of blackout poetry to mature and mow. One that, in being read, in fact opened me up to a deep mystical union with my new Terran neighbours, and brought me to reconsider the prudence of our own missionary revelation. What indeed could we add to this profound marvel of a story? So it is that, after much soul-searching, I have redirected this missive's carbon copy from the Planetary Assessment Committee to the Ministry for Amendment, and made plans for my own fulfilled yet sorrowful withdrawal. It is thus with great melancholy and even greater joy that I humbly submit this text to the Journal for the Association of Therolinguistics, as at once a review of a volume encompassing the long and illustrious history of the discipline, and an entree to a poetic document of multi-species authorship that reminds us that the field's cutting-edge contributions to understanding the place of the living in the pluriverse are far from concluded. I attach the found poem herewith in the hope that it might be published alongside as an entry in its own right, and I shall leave my well-thumbed copy of this excellent volume among the trees and critters to invite any further response. Perhaps still others will take up the promises whispered therein and compose their own scripts to further fill the pages of this most distinguished journal. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. That was fantastic. And I have lots of questions scribbling away while you were reading, but I think we'll hold the questions until the end. And that way, I think we'll get more of a plural vocal discussion going, because I'm sure there will be lots of points of connection and overlap. So I will jump in now to introduce Jeanne Dubino. She is a professor of English, Global Studies, and Animal Studies at Appalachian State University, which is in North Carolina, USA. She has been a visiting assistant professor of literature and women's studies at Bilkent University in Turkey, a Fulbright scholar and researcher at Egerton University in Kenya, a Fulbright specialist at Northeastern University, China, and visiting scholar at Ain Shams University, Egypt. This summer, she will be a Fulbright specialist at the Federal University of Paraíba in Brazil. Her publications include collections, essays, articles, and reviews on animal studies, travel, gender, and the modernist writer Virginia Woolf. She is currently working on a monograph on stray, street, free-ranging dogs in literature that I've been lucky enough to have heard some samples of, so I'm really eager to have this come out very soon. Thank you very much. I'll turn.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction, and many thanks to Cowrie as well for organizing this year-long symposium, which has been so joyful. So I will share my screen and put up my PowerPoint and get started here. All right. So there we go. All right. Title: Stray Dogs in Contemporary Fabulous Fiction. So I am going to look at 3 short stories that were published in the middle of the 20th century and that come from Iran. Here, let me just move my screen here. From India, Iran, and Pakistan. And if I have time, and I think I will, I do tend to talk fast, but I will have print on the screen for you to follow as well. I want to end with a short essay by Orhan Pamuk called What I Know About Dogs. So basically 3 fiction, 3 nonfiction. So the way I'm setting up my presentation is I first want to talk about the form of the short story as a new kind of neo-fable. Then I want to provide very brief background on stray dogs, and not just stray street free-ranging dogs, but also unhoused, unhomed people, just because the stories I'm going to talk about feature humans as well who are not always homed. And then I will look at the 3 stories plus the essay again, if there is time. So as far as the form goes, here is, I got these, a lot of the first 3 items, particular from the writers listed below and the asterisks. But I want to look at the new sort of fable, the neo-fable, the latest incarnation of the animal fable in terms of 3 parts: the introductory sketch, the action, and then the concluding comment, where I'm referring back to Tobias Meneley's comment during the wonderful presentation I got to hear yesterday, where we have the human voice as the interpretant. So fables are fabulous. They're made up. They're about other worlds. But the stories and the essay I'm going to consider are very realistic, a la naturalistic, sort of in the style of Zola. And he's very much on my mind right now. I've been listening to his books. They tend to be very grim, as you will see. Now, fables have a moral, and if there's a moral of the stories I'm looking at, it is not that might makes right. And of course, that is a very problematized theme, but rather the theme that emerges, as you will so clearly see, is sympathy. Aesopian fables tend to be about non-human species, but the fables I'm going to consider are multi-species, and like fables, these are allegorical, very true of the genre. So real brief background. It's in my reading on what is a stray dog, I know that there are so many. There's a big taxonomy of dogs. There are street dogs, there are stray dogs. Stray is usually used in the US. Village dogs, free-ranging, community. Some argue that dogs are not homeless. They find a home somewhere. I'm particularly fond of Anibal Arrighi's term reversibility, where he, in his study of the wild boars of Barcelona, he says they start off as domesticated, living with someone, then they go out into the streets. And so a lot of these terms here are overlapping and they're not stable. And I think that's important to emphasize. Now, what we'll find is the stories I'm looking at look at dogs, individual, singular dogs, but the literature often, non-humanities literature tends to focus on dogs in terms of numbers. And that being the case, I thought I would provide numbers. So it's hard to say how many dogs there are on the planet. There are 8 billion of us humans. Some estimate up to 1 billion dogs. Who estimates that the number of stray, street, free-ranging, etc. dogs is about 200 million. So I thought I would provide new numbers for the stories, the background of the stories that I'm looking at. India by far has the most, and then we have Iran, Pakistan, Turkey, or Turkiye as the country is increasingly being called, has 10 million. And this description from James Serpell's wonderful book, The Domestic Dog, refers to the way street dogs, stray dogs are often perceived by society at large as stateless refugees, tolerated and occasionally pitied as hangers on, but never properly assimilated or accepted. And I'm so reminded of how the 280 million people who are now living outside the country of their birth are also represented as foreign bodies contaminating the body politic. And I will get into politics briefly. And that quotation is from Nadita Sharma's wonderful book, Home Rule. But I'm really focusing on dogs. So let me get into the stories now, and I'm going to kind of look at the kind of way they flow. So the first one by R.K. Narayan, great Indian writer who lived over the course, as you can see here, of the 20th century, very celebrated. I included a postage stamp. He is famous for writing about Malgudi, a fictional South Indian town. And the story that I'm going to be talking about comes from Malgudi days, first published in 1941, and this volume was published in 2006. So let me start with the beginning. We can see here in this particular introduction that the street dog, the village dog, who is the protagonist of this story, is described first as an object. But then the object quickly moves from it to he, and the ordinariness is emphasized. Commonplace dog, undistinguished, and this is a very kind of trope that you see in the descriptions of dogs. He's lived on the street. His tail is mutilated. Oh, and another, mark that shows how ordinary he is. He's undistinguished. His tail is mutilated from fighting a lot, born on the street. He fights a lot. His pugnacity is needless. And I think I need to just let my dog out of the room. So if you would just excuse me for a minute. I have a house guest right now, actually a house guest from Ramallah, and so who's had some interesting stories to tell. Anyway, so you can see that he fights a lot, and he has a lot of scars on his body, but he seems to enjoy fighting. I mean, his pugnacity is needless. He loafs in the evenings. He picks up food on the road. He seems to have a pretty good life. And the fact that he's 2 years old at this point is a good sign. The average street dog lives about a year and a half. So his life carries on in a pleasant way for 3 years, and then things change. And so then we move into the action of the story. After about 3 years, a beggar appears at the market where the dog had been living, and this beggar had been taken care of by an old woman. So she brings him up to the market gate, and the dog, who is unnamed in the story, is sleeping nearby. He comes up to the man, the blind beggar, and the beggar says, "What a beauty you are, come with me." Does that not sound beautiful? It's almost like Christ-like. And the dog willingly obliges. And they seem to have a very simpatico, symbiotic relationship. The dog guards the old man's coins, and then the old man feeds him. But then things change. The old man leaves his caretaker, the only one who cares for him. And so the villagers look after each other. One of the secondary characters is a ribbon vendor who gives the old man this white tape and says, keep the dog with you. This shifts the relationship between the old man and the dog, who loses his freedom. And remember that first paragraph, he was free. He loses his freedom completely. He starts starving, the bones stuck on his haunches. Things get really bad. And so after a while, when the villagers see how deplorable the dog's condition is, the perfumer steps up and snips the cord. So the dog gets to run free. But then what happens? The dog returns to the old man, who then puts a chain on him. And then in the final sad paragraph, we see that the dog is chained forever to this old man. "Death alone," cried the ribbon seller, who functions as a chorus, looking at it with a sigh. "What can we do with a creature who returns to his doom with such a free heart?" So who is the blind character? Not the old man. The story is called The Blind Dog. So I'm going to return to this, but let me run through this next story by Sadegh Hedayat, who is an Iranian writer. He lived, as you can see, in the first half of the 20th century. He died very sad, very depressed. He was repressed by his government, but he died in Paris. And here is his tomb. He was a modernist writer influenced by Kafka, and he was a vegetarian, a great lover of animals. He is considered to be a kind of post-colonial writer, wandering between home and exile. A stray dog in Farsi, Narayan, by the way. I am so sorry. My house is just a little bit chaotic right now. I've got to let my dogs in.
Absolutely no worries, Jeannie. In fact, the eruption of the dog is a really creative element here.
We're really happy to have our visitor, and so, but it does make the dogs a little bit back and forth. But anyway, the Hedayat is considered to be a post-colonial writer who wrote between home and who wandered between home and exile. And the stray dog means wander in Farsi. So the story I'm about to talk about is a very autobiographical dog. So anyway, so I want to talk about that. So anyway, this story starts off with a different kind of dog. He's immediately personified as a he, the dog, and we later see that he has a name. His name is Pat. He's heavily anthropomorphized. You can see the intelligent human eyes, the eyes with a human soul, eyes, well, here we have wounded gazelle, resemble those of a human being, 2 brown eyes. So he's a dog who obviously is looking very much. He's another pitiable figure, treated worse than the poor village dog in Narayan's. Actually, I don't see the dog as a poor village dog until he becomes tied to the man. But errand boys beat him. He's pelted with rocks. So these 2 things stand out. And then, of course, you can see in this first description, he's a Scottish breed of dog. And so he's kind of European. You see the autobiographical element right away. We have a European or Europeanized dog who is in exile in his own country of birth. And in the action then that takes place, we're immediately then focusing on the past, we're in Narayan's story very much about the present. There are three sets of memories. There's the atavistic memory, where somehow in his genes there are memories of the meadows in Scotland. Then there's the Proustian moment, where the smell of rice custard takes him back to his puppyhood when he lived in a house. And then the third, more recent memory is how he came to be in this village square. His rut came on. I mean, usually you think of heat applied to dogs, but males also have increased sexual desire. So basically his master had taken him for a car ride from his house, and he let him out of the car. The dog smelled a dog in heat, ran away, came back, and the master had taken off. And that's how he comes to be in this square, Baraman Square, which is near Tehran. And lying in this village square, living a terrible life. So then a car comes up, a man emerges, and it's not clear if this car is of his previous master or another one, but the dog goes running after it and runs and runs and runs till he can run no farther, and then he pulls himself off to the side of a ditch. And we know he's going to die. And I found these wonderful illustrations of this story. And here's the website here. And instead of a villager who's kind of mourning his death, we have these three hungry crows hovering about his head, who are just waiting for him to die. And you can see that feeling of, impending doom, which we had seen near the end of the story. So again, more sort of the pathos, getting back to the theme, who is the center of the story here, but Pat the dog, and the story becomes a kind of elegy for his death. And the final story writer I'm looking at is Saadat Hasan Manto, who is a Pakistani writer. However, he has a life more complicated than that. But his life is similar to that of Hedayat's. He too died when he was only in his early 40s. And the story he writes is also very autobiographical. But whereas Hedayat is actually censored by the Iranian government, Manto is more celebrated. I just showed this Google Doodle, which appeared in 2020, and a film has been made of his life called Manto. So the story I'm reading comes from this collection, which was translated and published in English in 1987. So Manto wrote in Urdu. But about his life, he was born in what is now North India. And then he lived in Bombay after partition. He was forced to move to Pakistan. He lived in Lahore, and he was considered to be a muhajir, or a refugee from India. So you're going to see this notion of refugee in betweenness in the story, The Dog of Titwal. So in this setting here, this story, Narayan's story is set in a village. Hedayat's is set in a city square. This one is set on the border between Pakistan and India. And so we have two soldiers on one side, Indian soldiers on the other side, who are Pakistanis. And so they're sitting on either side of this border, and this introduction starts off on the Indian side. The soldiers had been singing, and then a deep sadness falls over them. Then you have that trope of the barking dog. There emerges the dog. So the first thing that the Indians do when they see him is they give him a name, Junjun, and they also give him a nationality. He could be a Pakistani dog, but they declare by giving him an Indian name that he is an Indian name. There's a wonderful essay by Susan Harris called The Dogs of Titwal, Imagining Animals in Partition, where she says that street dogs tend to be tabula rasas. And so you can see this impulse to kind of name them. They label and they tag him. And they also, you can see, jeer at him, all right, and call him a son of a bitch. Well, the next scene takes us to the Pakistan side, and you can see that the Pakistanis do the same thing the Indians did. They give him a Pakistani name, which is Shunshun, and they declare that he's a Pakistani dog. And they take the label off of him. And so you can see this impulse toward naming, toward identifying. And they also try to figure out if he is a refugee or a traitor, because in this kind of warlike setting, everyone has to take a side. Even dogs now have to decide if they are Indian or Pakistani, we read. And so even dogs have to take sides. And where was the, yeah. And so anyway, so we can sort of see how dogs are kind of caught up in this war. At the same time, we can see the absolute pointlessness of war. Nobody could be sure who was winning it. It's a complete waste of time, we read down here. And so in the middle of this pointlessness, while this dog is going from the Indian side to the Pakistani side, the two sides kind of turn this situation almost into a game. I'm almost thinking of a video game where the dog is running back and forth and back and forth. And so they're playing with the dog, the soldiers, they are playing with the dog, Jun Jun, Shun Shun. And what is a game for them down here between the two soldiers becomes for the dog terror, and he's running in circles between the two. And the pathos, just as you could see in the first two stories, is so heightened. And so here is the final concluding comment. So the dog runs toward the Indian side. The Harnam Singh fires him. The bullet catches him in the leg. And then the Himmat Khan on the Pakistan side tells him to do his duty, be a brave boy. So then as Shun Shun Jun Jun is dragging himself over to the other side, he is then martyred. So the cruel irony here is that even as no sooner is he anthropomorphized, but he is slaughtered. And the pathos of the scene is evident. Here we have the commentary, he dies a dog's death. So Harris makes the point, and this is so clear in any event, but she makes the point that partition literature typically focuses on humans, but here we're reminded that war, of course, affects other creatures here, and by individualizing a single dog, that pathos is so evident. And I will have time now to talk about Orhan Pamuk's essay, which runs in a different kind of vein from the other ones, as you will see. So just a few words about Orhan Pamuk, born in 1952, still very much alive. He just keeps writing one big novel after another. And he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2006. And the essay that I'm going to be talking about was first published in Öteki Renkler, or Other Colors, Essays and a Story. But it was also published in the New Yorker. And so I should add as well that I first was introduced to street dogs through his novels. I mean, he features street dogs in a lot of his novels. At least I was first introduced to street dogs in contemporary literature. So the essay that I'm looking at is called What I Know About Dogs. So here's the introduction. He, unnamed dog, was a mud-colored dog. And so the ordinariness, this is becoming a trope in these contemporary stories, nothing out of the ordinary. But we already start off on a kind of happier note than the other stories. Though this dog's eyes were sad, and though he has mournful eyes, and we return to Manto's story, this dog is wagging his tail, and he's given a chance to show curiosity. He wants to get to know us. And so when he had done so, he stuck his wet nose into the carriage. And we think about the dog who, in the first story by Narayan, who comes up to the beggar. And animals, one is reminded, are always curious, not just dogs, but the curiosity emerges. And of course, that's not just a human characteristic. So Pamuk shows himself, I'm going to call him Orhan as the narrator. He and the dog are in the carriage, and they draw back. And notably, the dog draws back too. And so we're kind of seeing this reciprocal reaction. And there's more of an attempt here on the part of Pamuk to kind of look at him, acknowledge that he's being looked at, and to kind of establish a kind of rapport with the dog. But let's go to the title. Orhan Pamuk asks what I know about dogs. And so he and his daughter, Ruha, look at him carefully, a four-legged creature. What was it like to be a dog? We think of, what was it like to be a bat? I close my eyes. And so he thinks about how we know about dogs. And so he tries to recall all the things he knows about dogs. He comes up with a list at first of 7 items, and I'm putting the second item on the list. Dogs in Turkish illustrated novels, and dogs who have been translated into Turkish say hav, but dogs in foreign illustrated novels say wolf. And so think about Therolinguistics, the different languages that dogs have. And I also think of illustrated novels, children's literature. We know about animals through literature. And so the essay, in a way, becomes a kind of, this very short essay, fewer than 700 words, becomes a kind of reflection on how we know animals. And so we can see that the speaker says we know animals by encountering them and through our imagination, through culture, and then also, and I'm not featuring this part, through other people and what they have to say about dogs. Well, anyway, his imagination runs cold. This is all I can remember. He talks with the driver about the dog experiences that he has had. And then the Orhan opens his eyes after trying to think about what he knows about dogs. And he writes, I opened my eyes and decided that people actually remember very little. I must have seen tens of thousands of dogs in this world, and when I was looking at them, they struck me as beautiful. The world surprises us in the same way. It is here, there, right next to us. Then it fades and everything turns to nothing. And so we see that he has this Aristotelian moment of wonder. He's struck with how beautiful they are. And remember the way that even the beggar at the beginning says, oh, you are so beautiful. But the moment doesn't last in the way that moments don't last in that Keatsian way, that ode to melancholy. You touch the why am I forgetting the name of the flower? But as soon as you touch it, all the leaves fall off. But anyway, he has this moment of wonder with a dog. So this is the penultimate paragraph. But then he returns to his list. This is the last item in the list, what I know about dogs. And you can see how different this ending is from the ending of the other 2 stories, which ended almost pure pathos. Here we have 2 years after I wrote this piece, so we move ahead in time, I was attacked by a pack of dogs in McHugh Park. McHugh Park is a big park in Istanbul. They bit me. I had to have 5 injections at the rabies hospital in Sultanahmet. And by the way, I can relate to that because I too got bitten by a dog who was not vaccinated, not in Turkey, and I had to have 5 injections, and it wasn't the worst experience. But anyway, what stands out here is that these dogs are not victims. They are actants. They show agency, and you almost get the feeling like the Empire Strikes Back, the canine Empire Strikes Back. Is this kind of a retribution? I don't know. So my concluding thoughts are not on the PowerPoint, but I guess that I want to say, what to make of it all. Short kind of conclusion. Yesterday, Laura Brown had talked about the genre of the fable as a distinctive form of vitality. So what I kind of want to show in these stories, how stray dogs represent a particularly disruptive and productive kind of vitality. There's something about straying that kind of disrupts the narrative. The dogs the narratives tend to be brief, and the dogs tend to be kind of inscrutable. We don't entirely know what to make of the stories that we've read. Even as 2 of the authors, Hedayat and Manto, show how strays can evoke contempt when we see the kinds of responses they get from the people they live with. Within all 3 of the fabulous stories, we see how they are portrayed to provoke the sympathy of readers. And what I know about dogs, on the other hand, strays' energy is even more threatening than that of vagrants and outsiders. And we can see how they kind of disrupt the narrative, and how perhaps the way Pamuk concludes his essay is even more potentially radical. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about 3 amazing stories and essay.
Thank you, Jeannie. Fantastic. And my head's swimming with so many old and new to me stories, and the essay is new to me especially. So thanks so much, always, for provoking my thinking in new directions. Just when you think you know everything about dogs, they are great species that way. Wonderful. So we have plenty of time for questions. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand, or you can drop it into the chat and I'll be happy to read it for you. Any takers? Anybody burning with questions? If not, I will roll in, abusing my privilege as moderator to ask my questions, because I always do have. And I have a question, I think, both for Jeannie and Matthew, as I'm listening to you speak. And apologies if this is kind of a left of field kind of question, but it really is a genuine question coming from a place of where I am as a teacher and scholar right now. I'm listening to both of you give me wonderful new ways of thinking about cross-species relations, human-animal relations, and the fabulous nature of animals themselves. And even ordinary dogs can be fabulous in this case. The case is clearly made. But I'm also thinking too about how both of you in very different ways are talking about the current status of knowledges of animals and the role of the university, increasingly uncomfortable role of the university through particularly, I think, humanist animal studies traditions that are now gathering enough force and weight and time to become traditions, and in many ways looking forward to where this is going and helping me to suddenly realize that I've been looking backwards maybe too much and to think forwards of where we're going with this. Jeannie, we're both literature professors, so I can say that I am thinking about how the short story increasingly is at the center of my teaching, because it works so well, not just as a representative of the fable tradition, and it's a great way of bringing history into the classroom, but for short attention spans of the 21st century and ever shortening, students, my undergraduates, that's all I teach, really respond well to that. And I think in many ways, I also wonder about these authors' deliberate choices to launch these, for their time periods, very risky arguments, risky perspectives on dogs who people have strong opinions about, trying to cultivate a sense of sympathy. Particularly, I'm thinking of the short stories, many of which are set at a time when rabies, and still in places like India, rabies still is alive, as you said, in Turkey, is a very live and everyday concern. That format actually is moving beyond the walls of the university or academic knowledges and is reaching out to a more general population, perhaps deliberately, moving maybe in some ways a post-humanistic approach to critiquing the university. Looking forward actually takes up that responsibility. And that catches up with this sort of post-species perspective of not thinking of them as objects in a box, but thinking of how we're always interacting in positive and, with rabies, very clearly illustrating a dangerous way too, that we are co-evolved species, we share diseases, we share love, but we share diseases. That this is one thing that I wondered if you were thinking about that, or even identify with that post-humanistic, post-species kind of thing. And I'm getting the similar vibe, Matthew, because you're setting us up in this future where universities are pluriversities, thank you, and thinking about how we could be doing things very, very differently to how we're doing now. And we're going to have to, because the current crumbling conditions are, or perpetual crisis conditions of the humanities, really have to go somewhere. And where you're going with it, I'm on board. I'm buying a ticket for that. I don't like it where it is right now. And I think it's really beautiful what you're trying to help us to envision and imagine. But also I'm noticing with your points of reference, there's a cleverness there that I want to put right in the foreground, and that it's all feminist scholars. And I also wonder by not calling attention to that deliberately. If I know Haraway hates this term and it doesn't seem to have a lot of purchase yet, but there's a certain, in addition to post-speciesist, post-humanist, perhaps post-feminist thing going on there that, again, I'm not sure if you either want to go in any of these directions, but I'd really like to hear more about how you're both thinking about how the things that you're talking about are both teachable, not just within university structures, but really have to be taught outside them too. And go.
Matthew, did you want to start or?
I don't mind. You can go first. Sure.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. A lot of comments. Yeah. It's so hard for me as a teacher not to kind of think about how I could teach so much of what I read. But I guess that I'll talk first of all about the humanities and how one sees if one, and I'm having been an English department chair, I still look at the Chronicle, I look at Inside Higher Ed, and one doesn't have to just look at those to see that, oh no, what's happening to the humanities? And so one way I think of, getting students to care about literature and to care about the mind and to care about sort of experiences is to teach stories. And yet we also, one of the things that we hear about are how students aren't reading as much. So I do think that stories can be a kind of way into that. And interestingly, when we first started offering animal studies classes at my university 11 years ago in 2013, we had almost no takers. The classes were so small. But now when I taught Animal Planet last year, I had 68 students just in that class. And now we have an animal studies minor. So suddenly students now seem to care. And the minor is only getting bigger because we have a vet tech program. So I think that stories can function as a way of, getting students maybe interested in reading if you can make it approachable and doable, which is much easier to do with short stories and graphic fiction, like say Leica, than with longer works. So I guess that I'm always thinking of how I would teach something. Next semester, I get to teach a course called Global Dogs. I have to call it global because it's going to be a global studies class. But it's about dogs around the world. And I'm thinking about how one of the best ways, of course, of teaching animals is not just through literature, culture, the imagination, but through ethology and getting students to look at dogs, and then through biology. And so I feel like as someone in the humanities, I can kind of make a contribution to, how we get to know animals. And then just to kind of awaken students' curiosity by showing that animals have curiosity and these stories are about curiosity. So stories can be a way of teaching students about themselves, and they are so focused on themselves. And so for that reason, our minor is called a human animal minor, because we want to kind of look at animals kind of in that relationship. But as far as like what to do outside of educating people outside of the university, sometimes I think I should just stop writing anything academic and just write for the public. Like I'm horrified by Roundup, all the chemicals my neighbors use, the leaf blowers, the way they kill insects, spew volatile organic chemicals. And I think I should be writing pieces for the community to try to get my neighbors to do things that allow us to live much more harmoniously with animals. So I guess that when you say outside of the academy, that makes me immediately think of what I could do as an activist, in terms of writing and in terms of taking this outside of outside of the academy. But I think just by teaching and getting students to be aware and making them mindful of animals in a way, we're using our classrooms as opportunities to enrich the world. But yeah, how can you kind of bring this language outside? I guess teaching is, I don't know, it feels a lot more gratifying to me than the activist work that I do, which seems like, very Sisyphean and thankless and very hard to get anything accomplished. But yeah, so I mean, that's kind of a long way of saying I think that stories are such a great way, a great way to get students started, and then you can, build on that.
I totally agree that teaching is a form of activism, and one that you can actually feel a lot more hopeful in the important role of forming selves, right? That it plays, and opening people up to experiences or knowledges or points of view that they might not otherwise have come across. It was for me in many ways. So, and I definitely know that this short story is one that my students, when I've taught a unit in experimental writing, really love. And in discussion groups and so on, I think obviously the academic context matters in the way it plays around with genres of I'm referring not to my own story, by the way, but Le Guin's 1974 story, the way it plays around with the form of the journal article or the letter or note or whatever to the editor as a way of telling a story that makes them think about animal worlds and how animals perceive the worlds and how they might act and so on, and what the limits of that might be, as well as the possibilities. Another thing I was thinking in relation to that is that the part of what it enables us to do, given what we're thinking about sort of the role of knowledge and academics and scholarship in the world, is that these stories and lots of the stories that intrigue me are ones in which the heroes are academics, like are scholars of some sort. Le Guin having been raised by anthropologists and married to a historian, and herself a scholar, often had protagonists who were, disciplinarily trained, who were key to the action, and that their knowledge actually has a role in the plot, has a role in the what goes on in the politics and everything else, and it's one of the means by which worlds are translated or traversed or become legible to one another, and the importance of knowledge in that is really significant. And it's not just her with her anthropologists, but in contemporary science fiction, Vandermeer's biologist in the can't remember the name of the Annihilation and so on, Chang's linguist in Story of My Life, and there's many other examples where it's actually the military turns up at some scholar's door to say, can you help us explain this strange thing that's happening? You asked about the ecofeminist SF tradition, which is just the one I am situated in and part of. There's probably a rather unknown Australian dimension to that, not just with Le Guin's visit, in the late, when was it? I can't remember. Melbourne Worldcon, she came here and actually ran a writing workshop that was really impactful for a bunch of Australian SF writers. But even just in Perth, where Helen Merrick was, and Tess Williams and others, and even if all I do is make people aware of Rosaline Love's work, this will have had a really good effect, because she wrote some amazing short stories in that if you're interested in Le Guin, you really will like them. Yeah, I really like that point about thinking about the future of knowledge and what that might mean, because I really, well, we really don't know what impact the disciplinary divides have had, and how that history is being played out. And there's, obviously a lot that we could think about, but a lot of exciting things I think are happening in what has become possible now in terms of interdisciplinary work and interdisciplinary thinking that, I've experienced when it wasn't, and certainly many others would have, that the capacity that we now have for, a lot of it is people trained in fieldwork and anthropologists working alongside scientists, but I think that the linguists and literary scholars and many others are going to be able to, or already are, and are going to be increasingly able to collaborate in groundbreaking and sort of mind-blowing ways. And there's examples of all sorts of fascinating things from, ancient Egyptian archaeology and the ways the hieroglyphs are interpreted, that you can only really do better if you sort of have an understanding of ethology and animal behavior, to know what the movement and action means. This is amazing research of Linda Evans from Macquarie, through to all sorts of other things going on today. So there's something about that interdisciplinarity and the open speculative part of it. Another thinker in this tradition who is really important to me, and who, it's knowing that she's a Le Guin fan is part, is a good reason to latch on, was Isabel Stengers and her focus on the question of speculation and the significance of the speculative mode for philosophy, and particularly for philosophy of science and interdisciplinary thinking around knowledge of subjects. So knowledge that does not just treat the world as objective, as a thing that's out there that we need to reduce or quantify, but what it means when you're talking about the fact that the thing something about is not a thing. It's a being. It's an existent. It's a doer of things, and that we can describe what it does in terms of not just energy or relationship between matter, but action, imagination, creativity, ingenuity, and all of those verbs about verbing are the world. Like, those are the things we're trying to know. I think that sense is really core to science fiction, or to a certain tradition of science fiction, as it is to a certain tradition of philosophy of science. And so that's sort of where I would situate it.
Fantastic, both. My mind is now going straight to the idea that we as academics in animal studies orientation and reaching towards that creative overlap are perhaps just a symptom of a broader subspeciation, that we as humans are pushing towards an evolutionary leap, and that maybe fiction, if you follow current evolutionary theory, is functioning as that viral infection. So that maybe we're not teaching our students, but we're infecting them with some kind of thing that will transform life as we know it. Who knows? This is fun. But I could, instead of having fun and talking myself, I'm noticing that Kari has popped a question into the chat. And since you're here, Kari, I want to know, would you like to ask your question? Or would you like me to read it?
I can. This was really just, thank you both. I enjoyed the presentations. This was really just a very minor thing. I dropped it in the chat mostly because I didn't want to derail the whole conversation, but I was struck when, Jeanne, you were reading your your excerpts that you emphasized always the distinction between, right at the beginning of the text, the dog is referred to as an it, and then later becomes gendered and so on. But unless I'm mistaken, all of the texts that you're referring to are not written in English originally. So I was wondering how this works in the original texts. Because in languages with grammatical gender, for example, the gender of animals works quite differently to how it is in English. But I was just curious about this since you emphasized it in your readings.
Harry, you're too modest, though. Between the lines there is a question about therolinguistics and pronoun usage, and maybe that's a post-feminist question again.
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. So Narayan wrote in English, so we don't have to worry about his movement from it to he. But I would say that with you ask about Manto's Urdu, the dog, even if it's not clear how the translation was. By the way, I read a review of the translation, and the reviewer was not happy with the translation. And you know what, there might be a Pakistani professor on campus. I might actually find the original and see what he says. In Turkish, there is no difference in gender, and so he becomes the default. Pamuk would have approved of the translation because it was made. I mean, he's still alive, and so he does work with his translator. So he would have been okay with the he. But I mean, I do note that the dog could as easily have been a she. We don't really know in that case. And then with the one in Farsi by Hedayat, the personification, the anthropomorphization is so evident, all the different adjectives. But yeah, I think that if I were to say turn this into a publishable essay, I would really have to have someone help me out with the translation, especially the Urdu. I know a little Turkish, and I could go back to the original and kind of work with that, but I would definitely need some help with the Urdu and the Farsi. Actually, I have a good friend who's Iranian, so I could work with her. But I think that gender kind of comes up here. Why is he always the default when we talk about dogs? And that kind of takes us into that kind of perhaps question too. I don't think gender is really sort of highlighted, except for maybe the case of Pat, who when he acts like a dog, he then loses that domestic home that he had when he takes off and kind of follows his instincts. But I think that's a really good question. But the rest of the text would kind of support the anthropomorphization. But I think you do have to take that into account, because other languages do not distinguish between he and she. I mean, the Romance languages seem to be obsessed with it, where everything is gendered, but other languages are not hung up on that. And then that does take us into, how do we relate to animals? So you're getting me thinking, and now I'm really glad that you're going to make me even more mindful of that. And I mean, this is a challenge working with global text. One is working with translations unless unless you know the language well.
Yeah, for contemporary. Go, Kari.
No, I just wanted to follow up on what you already said, Susan, that this obviously becomes even more complicated when we're trying to understand animal languages and their crazy ideas about gender.
Well, I'm thinking too, as an old timer teaching these texts, that students today have contemporary sensibilities where they're quite, as often as not, critical of these dimorphic gender constructions, and they question that too, and particularly as you're projecting problematic human ideals across species lines that are highly culturally and historically specific and restrictive. So
it's
absolutely.
funny, the students really want to push English into non-gendered with their use of they. I mean, they made me cringe until perhaps about 3, 4 or 5 years ago. But But I know that when I'm teaching text about animals and we don't know the gender, I'll just kind of now fall, even though it makes me wince, to the default they, if only because, you know, they typically is a number, and often students will use they without being clear about the referent and so on. But they becomes kind of useful in that case. But then there's the they, and then there's the it, and of course they is the plural of, you know, singular it. So you get into all kinds of interesting, when you talk about pronouns and gender and animals, that really can, you know, take you to some interesting territory, linguistic territory.
I hadn't thought about it as articulately as you just put it, Jeanne, but definitely along with the increasing, especially in American spoken English, the default use of they, even just in casual conversations, that there is a parallel, also through other forces, a parallel, I don't say quite demonization, but negative connotation gathering around the usage of it. I mean, who wants to be an it? Nobody embraces that, right? It's like being a hipster. No one calls themselves a hipster. Or do they? And I'm just, is my ignorance showing?
I think it's really interesting the way in which not just evolutionary transformations, but, you know, linguistic experimentation and sort of the cutting edge of transforming how we speak based on you know, fundamental linguistic categories like pronouns or otherwise are played out, and, you know, can be particularly explored through experimental literatures, but also through interdisciplinary work at the intersection between animal sciences and humanities, like you know, thinking about reading like the 20th century animal psychologists, comparative psychologists, ethologists, and so on, and they often, like, it'll still be probably often couched in a particular very gendered or racialized or other sort of civilizational narrative, but at the same time they were asking questions about animal perspectives, animal, you know, language or subjects or concepts and so on, how animals divided up the world, like what were the categories that they used to, you know, divide things up into, way before humanists were even considering that these were possible things to think about, and often in really quite, or sometimes in quite productive and speculative ways, where they would have a go at, you know, thinking about the different categories that might be central to whether to, you know, a range of animals or to this particular species and so on, you know, which includes in some ways questions of gender or pronouns, other times not at all, but really ought to be opened up to think about what the relationship between I'm thinking of those old Derrida Geschlecht essays, but, you know, gender and genre and modes of being, like and that these are not just questions about human existence. These are questions about all forms of living existence. Yeah.
Ari, you had your hand up and then it's down. Do you want to jump in, or?
I want to leave room for other people. I just wanted to maybe say to Matt that I really enjoy. I mean, I wish I could read your text. I'm not sure I could take it all in orally, but the one thing it reminded me of was the another kind of classic text of the academic essay in the future, which is the historical notes at the end of The Handmaid's Tale, where also it emerges that, you know, certain, even though societal changes have taken place and apparently we're much more progressive in the future, various forms of prejudice and so on have remained. And I was just wondering if you were, in writing your piece, were also thinking about that it's not now that everything has been solved, but that there are actually various forms of discrimination that have gone unquestioned, even despite the Therolinguistic revolution.
Mm-hmm. That is a question that I really actually did think about just because of and decided to go with the utopian mostly mostly I think because I was probably had been reading too much depressing things that where the only focus really is on the future as post-apocalyptic, the future as so on, and that's too depressing. So I think that's why probably the academic tone is so mostly optimistic. But yeah, you're totally right that those questions have really remain central. But yeah, I think what interested me, and which I certainly don't think I've managed it yet, but I think the better question is, or the one that I wanted to explore is, how do we do something else? How do we compose, mutually thriving worlds between species as well as between cultures and so on? And yeah, how might a little academic text, be a microcosm, or at least to help to think through some of the concepts that might be significant for that.
As the moderator, it is my unfortunate job to point out that we are at the end of time. This is a fantastic discussion, though, wonderful presentations. And I also, before you head out, folks, just want to call attention to the fact that the chat has just lit up brilliantly with questions, diving down deeper into the questions of it, with what dogs say and how we name them in other cultures. And Matt, one quick question is, how do we get a hold of this story? Could you pop a link into the chat, or just tell us where to find it if it's published already?
It's not published yet, but I really want to publish it this year, given that it is 50 years since Le Guin's was, and then 50 years before the book that it's reviewing. So hopefully it will be published this year, and I will send the link around.
Well, I will drop a wild hint that you have not one, but two editors-in-chief of journals, hint, hint, right here in the room with you. And I think we can confirm from this session that an eager audience awaits. Similarly, Jeanne, please keep us all posted as your work progresses, because I'm seeing also so many great opportunities to enrich my teaching and my scholarship through both of your presentations. So thank you very, very, very much. And I also want to put a shout out that the next session is coming up in just a half an hour, or 28 minutes. So please come back, everyone, for the elephant session, which should be fantastic as well.